So picture this, right? You're in a room and you're arguing with someone over something completely, I don't know, trivial, like the merits of online versus offline shopping.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Right. You're going back and forth, and one person is getting just increasingly agitated, insisting, the products they got were totally wrong. And the other person is demanding receipts, tracking numbers, hard proof.
And the temperature just keeps rising.
Exactly. And before you know it, the whole conversation just completely devolves. Someone throws their hands up, sighs loudly, and it's just like, I don't have time for this.
Yeah, that classic breaking point.
It is so frustrating. And usually when we walk away from a total collapse like that, we tend to blame ourselves in very specific internal ways.
We really do. We usually default to thinking it's a language issue. Like we tell ourselves that if we just had a more expansive vocabulary, or if our accent sounded just a little more polished,
Oh,
or if we just didn't stumble over our words so much, people would finally stop interrupting us and, well, actually absorb our point.
I do that all the time. I literally walk away from a casual debate thinking my brain just couldn't bucker the information fast enough. I sounded like a sputtering engine, and I think if only I sounded smoother, I would have won that.
Right. But going through our source material today, it completely dismantles that assumption. Because that kind of conversational breakdown, it isn't a language failure at all.
Not at all.
It is a failure of articulation.
Mm.
And those are two very different things.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter if you're a child who is just learning a second language or, a senior executive sitting in some massive corporate boardroom. If you cannot structure your raw thoughts into a coherent architecture, you are practically invisible in that room.
Invisible. Man, that is such a harsh reality, but it feels so accurate. So the mission for our deep dive today is to unpack a specific framework from our sources that prevents that invisibility. It's about taking all that raw, chaotic information and organizing it into something that is quite literally impossible to ignore. But, where do we even start with that?
Yeah.
Because my instinct is always to focus on delivery, like how I'm projecting my voice or, using my hands.
And that is the instinct for most people, but it's entirely backward. The foundation is that content will always trump style, every time.
Okay, so substance over flash.
Right. You can have this perfectly modulated, resonant speaking voice, and you can be wearing a meticulously tailored suit, but if the underlying material is hollow, you are just making pleasant noise. To be a truly effective communicator, you have to master the marriage of data and story.
Well, wait. I want to push back on that immediately, though. When I think of the word data, I think of massive spreadsheets and dry quarterly reports. Isn't throwing raw numbers at someone usually a guaranteed recipe for putting them straight to sleep?
If you deliver it as just an isolated list, yes, absolutely, people tune out instantly. But the strategy isn't to read a spreadsheet. It's to use data as an undeniable anchor for a narrative. There's this high-stakes example in the text from a famous debate at the Oxford Union that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, right. The debate over whether Britain owes reparations to its former colonies. And really quickly, before we dig into this, I want to make sure we are setting the right context for you listening. We are absolutely not taking a political stance on colonialism or weighing in on the actual historical arguments here.
Right, definitely not.
Our only goal is to impartially observe the structural mechanics of how this specific argument was constructed, exactly as it is laid out in the text.
We're purely looking under the hood at the engine of the rhetoric. So at this Oxford Union event, the first speaker took a very abstract philosophical approach.
Okay.
They argued that while, mistakes were made in the past, historical events of that scale are just far too complex, too messy, and ultimately impossible to quantify.
Which feels like a classic defensive dodge. If you're facing a massive, unmanageable problem, the easiest way out is to wave your hands and declare it too complicated for human measurement.
It's a very common tactic. But then a speaker named Shashi Tharoor steps up to the podium, and he completely refuses to play in that realm of abstract moral outrage.
He grounds it.
He counters the idea that history cannot be quantified by quantifying it with just brutal, undeniable precision.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Yeah.
But how did he actually deploy those numbers?
Well, he didn't just say many people suffered. He gave the room the exact human cost of World War I for his people. He listed 54,000 dead.
Wow.
Over 65,000 wounded, and 4,000 taken as prisoners of war. He pointed out that 1/6 of the entire British force was Indian.
I mean, that immediately changes the temperature of the room, but he went beyond just the casualties, didn't
He
he?
did. He itemized the logistics. Just
Yeah.
listen to the sheer overwhelming scale of these numbers. He cited 70 million rounds of ammunition, 600,000 rifles and machine guns,
That is insane.
4.2 million garments, 173,000 animals, and 370 million tons of supplies. And then he took that massive, dizzying mountain of data and he converted it into one single, devastating financial figure.
The punchline.
Exactly. He stated that in today's terms, the value extracted was roughly 8 billion pounds, or 84,000 crore rupees.
That is fascinating. By bringing that level of exact, undeniable specificity, the first speaker's claim that the past cannot be quantified doesn't just look like a weak argument anymore. It suddenly looks like an intentional lie.
Exactly. The data isn't just a list of facts, it is a weapon used to dismantle an opposing narrative.
And that is the marriage of data and story. The numbers act as the physical load-bearing pillars of the argument, and the story of extraction and scale is the building resting on top of them.
Beautifully put, yes.
But let's bring this down to earth for a second. Because you and I aren't usually debating historical reparations at the Oxford Union, right? I'm struggling to see how this heavy, data-driven storytelling applies to, say, a normal Tuesday morning marketing meeting.
Oh, it scales down perfectly. The text provides this brilliant example of a massive property development project in Mexico.
Okay.
These developers were building affordable housing for people who are currently living in tiny 700-square-foot homes, but they had 3 entire generations of a family packed under one single roof.
Oh, wow. Let me guess. Their marketing strategy was probably a brochure full of generic real estate buzzwords.
Spot on. They ran ads boasting about, new lush green projects at a cheap price. It was entirely adjective-driven, and it was failing miserably. They were getting a grand total of 7 phone calls a week.
Because lush and green are totally subjective. They don't disrupt anyone's day.
They don't introduce any friction or urgency. So they brought in a consultant named Chet Holmes. And Holmes didn't sit in a boardroom brainstorming catchier adjectives. He went looking for data.
Real numbers.
Yeah. He spent hours digging through academic research papers, specifically studying the long-term impacts of overcrowded living environments. And he extracted 3 terrifying data points.
I remember reading this part. The statistics he found were chilling.
First, he found that a child living in a severely crowded home has a 400% higher probability of death compared to a child in a standard home.
400%.
Second, boys born into those dense environments are twice as likely to fail in life by traditional metrics. And third, girls from those environments struggle significantly more with establishing independence as they grow up.
That is incredibly heavy. So how on earth does he turn academic research into a real estate pitch?
Well, he completely eliminated the lush greenery angle. He pivoted the entire campaign to ask parents a direct, piercing question. He put the data right in front of them and asked, do you want to reduce your family's chance of failure and save your child's life?
Wow. He took real estate and turned it into a literal life or death decision. He stacked the facts to create a deeply emotional narrative. And what was the outcome of that?
They went from 7 phone calls a week to 2,300 calls in a single week.
Just by swapping adjectives for research data. That's wild. And this dynamic applies beautifully to education, too. There's a section of the source about teaching medical conditions, specifically diabetes.
Right. The contrast there is stark. The traditional, dull way to teach diabetes is to just give the textbook definition. You stand at a whiteboard and explain that type 1 is where the pancreas fails to produce insulin, and type 2 is where the body's cells become resistant to it.
Which is perfectly accurate, but completely forgettable. I mean, it explains the what, but our brains don't hold on to a what very well.
Exactly. The great teacher, however, doesn't start with cellular definitions. They start with a narrative. They take you back to the year 1921. And at that time, a diabetes diagnosis in a child was an absolute death sentence.
Right.
And the teacher explains why the only known treatment back then was literal starvation.
Because without insulin to process the glucose, eating food practically poisoned the blood. So the only way to delay death was to literally stop eating.
Right. They forced children onto extreme starvation diets just to buy them a few agonizing months of life.
That's horrifying.
It is. But then the teacher introduces Frederick Banting and Charles Best, 2 researchers who had a wild idea. What if they could extract insulin from a healthy dog's pancreas and use it as a chemical key to unlock the human cells, allowing them to finally absorb the sugar?
And it worked.
They extracted the dog insulin, injected it into a dying, comatose child, and literally overnight the child woke up. The death sentence was broken.
See, if you tell me that story first, I am completely hooked. Now, I actually want to know the underlying cellular mechanics. I want to know how that chemical key works.
Exactly. The data has context now.
And the same goes for the microbiology example with Antony van Leeuwenhoek in the 1600s. If you just list taxonomy bacteria, fungi, algae, it's incredibly dry. But if you describe Leeuwenhoek taking a primitive, handcrafted microscope, looking at a single drop of seemingly crystal clear pond water, and discovering a chaotic, invisible zoo of creatures swimming around you, completely changed the frame.
You move from memorizing categories to exploring a hidden dimension.
It's like you're giving the science a soul. You invite the audience into a mystery. Okay, so we have a solid framework here, very concrete data with a compelling story. But this brings up a massive structural problem.
What's that?
What happens when you have airtight data and you have a great narrative wrapped around it, but people still don't change their behavior? Like they nod along, they agree with your premise, and then they go right back to what they were doing.
That is definitely the most frustrating hurdle in communication. And it brings us to the necessity of scale. You have to take your massive information and physically shrink it down to the audience's relatable scale of daily life. The human brain just cannot process massive numbers emotionally.
Right.
The source highlights a brilliant campaign from 1992 by the Center for Science and the Public Interest. They discovered that movie theater popcorn was just a nutritional catastrophe.
They had the hard data on that, right? Like a medium-sized bucket of theater popcorn had 37 grams of saturated fat.
They had the data and they publicized it everywhere, but nothing happened. People kept buying the popcorn.
Let's look at why that failed. Because 37 grams is a total abstraction. I mean, unless you are a nutritionist, you don't have a mental model for what a gram of saturated fat actually looks or feels like inside your artery.
It's just a number floating in the void. So the researchers realized their data lacked a relatable scale. So they called a press conference, and instead of handing out pamphlets with bolder fonts, they set up a long table. On this table, they laid out a McDonald's Big Mac, a large order of fries, a massive plate of eggs, bacon, and toast, and a complete steak dinner with all the sides.
Just a completely absurd amount of food.
And then they pointed to one single standard bucket of movie theater popcorn sitting right next to it all. And they told the cameras, this one bucket contains more artery-clogging fat than everything else on this table combined.
That is incredible. They didn't change the underlying data. They just translated it into a visual vocabulary that every single person instantly understands everyday meals.
They personalized the abstract danger, and the results were instantaneous. Popcorn sales plummeted across the country. The theater industry panicked, and they were quickly forced to change the type of oil they used to pop the corn.
Wow.
They didn't change their behavior because of a statistic. They changed it because the researchers turned a statistic into a visceral feeling.
This concept of shrinking the massive to expand empathy. Our sources apply this to charitable giving, too. And the psychology behind it is fascinating. We've all seen those charity appeals telling us that 11 million people, 1.1 crore people in a certain region are facing starvation, or that life expectancy across an entire nation is falling.
Right.
And the unfortunate reality is those campaigns often fail to generate action.
The researchers refer to those massive data points as statistic orphans.
What exactly is happening in our brains there? Like, why do we freeze up when we hear 11 million people?
It really comes down to evolutionary psychology and something called psychic numbing. Human brains evolved in small tribes, usually around 150 people, which is often referred to as Dunbar's number.
Okay, so we're wired for small groups.
Exactly. Our neural architecture is simply not designed to comprehend the suffering of millions of individuals simultaneously. When confronted with a number that large, the cognitive load is just too heavy. Our empathy circuits basically short out, and the issue becomes an abstract concept rather than a human tragedy.
So it's a bizarre flaw. We literally cannot feel empathy for 1 million people. We can only feel it for one.
Precisely. Which is why the charity strategy had to pivot. Instead of talking about 11 million starving people in Ethiopia or Zambia, a campaign focused entirely on one specific 7-year-old girl named Rokia from Mali who hadn't eaten in 5 days.
Wow.
By focusing the entire narrative on her face, her name, and her immediate reality, donations doubled.
It's a sobering realization about human nature. To be an effective advocate, you cannot demand that your audience expand their comprehension to fit
Yeah.
your massive data. You have to shrink your massive data to fit their human capacity.
You must anchor the abstraction to a single beating heart. So we've established the architecture now. You have the hard data, you've woven it into a narrative, and you've scaled it down so it emotionally resonates.
Right.
But none of that matters if the human brain physically cannot process the words coming out of your mouth. We have to look at the physical mechanics of delivery.
Because you could have the most beautifully constructed argument in the world, but if you mumble it while staring at the floor, you're still invisible.
Exactly. And to reiterate our very first point, this is not about fixing an accent. It is about volume and clarity. On a basic level, if you aren't physically loud enough to command the space, you just don't exist in the dynamic. But beyond volume, your enunciation must be crisp.
Let's break down the mechanics of why that matters.
Mm.
Because if someone is speaking to me and their words are muffled or blending together, my brain has to dedicate a significant amount of cognitive energy just to decode the syllables.
You're doing real-time audio repair in your head.
Right. And if my brain is burning calories trying to figure out what vowel you just used, I have very little processing power left to actually absorb the brilliant meaning behind your words. Every word needs to land in the listener's mind as a clean, effortless image.
It reduces the cognitive friction. Now, beyond just speaking clearly, the source analyzes how top-tier communicators physically control a room using two highly specific techniques. Both of them rely on the strategic use of silence. The first is called the emphasis pause.
Okay, how does the emphasis pause work in practice?
It's when a speaker intentionally, abruptly stops speaking right before a crucial word or data point. The sudden silence acts as an audio spotlight.
Interesting.
Our brains are wired to notice sudden changes in our environment. When a steady stream of talking suddenly stops, the listener's brain snaps to attention, anticipating what comes next. Then the speaker delivers the final word slightly slower and with more weight.
So, if someone stole money from you, instead of rushing through the sentence and blurting out, "He took 4 lakh rupees from me," you use the pause to create tension. You say, "He took 4 lakh rupees."
Exactly. That brief vacuum of sound forces the listener to actually register the gravity of the number. The second technique is even more potent for controlling the dynamic of a negotiation or debate. It's called the question pause.
This one makes me incredibly anxious just thinking about it.
It's highly confrontational in a very subtle way. This is when you make a provocative statement or you drop a heavy piece of data on the table and then you just stop talking. You leave a long, unbroken stretch of silence.
And the text points out you don't even need to ask a literal question, do you? You could just say something factual like, "You know there is a massive risk here," and then you do nothing.
You hold the silence. And biologically, silence in a social setting feels like a threat. It creates an uncomfortable pressure vacuum in the room. It implicitly signals to the other person that the ball is in their court. They are forced to step into that silence, either to defend themselves, concede the point, or acknowledge the heavy reality you just introduced.
That explains so much. I am terrified of silence in conversations. When there's a pause, my immediate physiological response is panic. I rush to fill it with ums, likes, or I just start repeating the point I just made because the quiet feels socially dangerous.
Most people do. But a masterful speaker doesn't fear the vacuum. They weaponize it. The person who is comfortable holding the silence is the person who controls the status of the room.
Okay, this brings up a really pragmatic issue for me.
Yeah.
We have this beautiful system now. Data is the coordinates, storytelling is the vehicle that transports the audience, and a well-timed pause is hitting the brakes. So they are forced to look out the window at what you're showing them.
I like that analogy.
Thanks, but let's be real. You can't just deploy dramatic pause or a killer statistic in a meeting tomorrow if you don't actually know what you're talking about.
And that is the ultimate revelation of the source material regarding the input-output equation. Everything we have discussed today, the devastating Oxford statistics, the brilliant housing data, the dramatic pauses, that is entirely output. But deep, relentless knowledge is the input.
Right. You cannot stand at a podium and confidently drop the statistic that the British Empire extracted 8 billion pounds of wealth if you haven't spent hours in the archives finding that number. Chet Holmes couldn't pivot that housing marketing strategy to focus on a 400% increased probability of death unless he had done the grueling, unglamorous work of reading thousands of dry academic papers.
The output on the stage is completely funded by the input in the library. If you want to master these rules, you cannot just learn speaking techniques. You have to be a voracious consumer of high-quality information. You must study finance to understand the numerical levers of power. You must read human psychology to understand cognitive load and empathy. The effortless articulation people admire is built on a massive foundation of quiet study.
So bringing this all together for you listening, if you want to be the kind of person who occupies the top tier of any room, the kind of person people actually stop and listen to,
Yeah.
you have to abandon the myth that great communicators are just born with a silver tongue.
It's a myth.
It really is. It is a definable, actionable system.
Mm.
Stop worrying about your accent. Stop blaming your vocabulary when an argument devolves. Start worrying about your substance. Use precise, meticulously researched data to build your foundation. Use relatable, human-scaled storytelling to build the house. And use the deliberate, crisp mechanics of your voice to open the door. When you do that, people won't just listen to you. They will actively wait for you to speak.
And tying back to the mechanics of delivery, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If the ultimate physical tool of a top-tier speaker is the question pause, pure, controlled silence. Think about what that means for us today.
Oh, that's interesting.
We live in an era that is biologically terrified of quiet. We are constantly filling the air with podcasts, background music, notifications, and just endless chatter. So maybe the most radical, powerful thing you can practice in your next conversation isn't speaking louder or finding a sharper argument, but giving someone the uncomfortable, magnetic gift of absolute silence.
What a brilliant tension to leave off on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking hard questions, keep studying the underlying data, and as always, keep exploring.